Hello and welcome to the Heartland Institute's live stream. I'm Sterling Burnett, Heartland Senior Fellow and Managing Editor of Environment Climate News. Now, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its sixth assessment report on climate change earlier this week. To say that it sucked the air out of the room from the perspective of media coverage is an understatement. Every day since the report's release, numerous media outlets have produced story after alarming story, citing the Summary for Policymakers section of the report, which continues to blame humanity for climate model simulated trends. So the climate models say the world is ending, and the media reports just mimic it, like parrots. They blame every bad weather event on climate change. For instance, a CBS News headline reads, "Island nations react to devastating UN climate change report. We are on the edge of extinction," despite the fact that the data shows island nations are gaining land. Now, as the host of Environment and Climate News podcast for the Heartland Institute, I wanted to bring on two colleagues and longtime warriors in the battle for truth over dystopian fantasy in the realm of climate science, economics, and policy. They are James Taylor, the president of the Heartland Institute, and award-winning meteorologist Anthony Watts, who is also a senior fellow for environment and the climate at the Heartland Institute. James, Anthony, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Sterling.
So, guys, what are each of your general thoughts, your sort of top-line overview of the IPCC's AR6 report and Summary for Policymakers?
Go ahead and lead off, Anthony.
Well, my assessment is that it's more of the same, just simply ramped up with a little bit extra scary. Many of the things that they have said in this report, we have heard again and again and again over the last 30 years since the original assessment report came out. We've heard, sea level rise is going to inundate everything. We've heard that the future is hellishly hot. We've heard that the oceans are going to acidify and dissolve all the animals and all this sort of nonsense. It's the same thing. The only really big difference here is that they've latched on to using a set of models which were recently disproven by the climate science community itself. The RCP 8.5 model, which is the one that everyone seems to latch on to for the worst case scenario for the future, has been used throughout this report. And it was discredited just 2 weeks ago as being not even possible because it said that it would require all of the fossil fuels existing on the planet to be burned by 2100 in order to reach that level of CO2. It's an impossible thing. And so even the climate science community said, no, can't even do it.
Yeah, I was about to say, it wasn't discredited by someone like myself or James or yourself, climate realists for a long time. It was discredited by the modelers who put the models together themselves, by the scientists who've been working with models that say they're running way, way too hot, which, by the way, is interesting since the previous generation models were already running too hot. James, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have two primary takeaways from this. First of all, very similar to when AR5 came out 5 or 6 years ago, the fifth assessment report. The Summary for Policymakers was quite alarmist and talking about doom and gloom and doomsday is here and all that. And of course, when you see the report for the first time and the media wants to talk about it, you read through very quickly the Summary for Policymakers and then you scan the text. And the first reaction is, wow, this is so over the top and so unsupported by the science that it strikes you as the bureaucracy, the far-reaching climate bureaucracy at the United Nations, making this as scary as possible to justify and perpetuate its existence in defiance of the actual science. And the same applies here in that when you're talking about a code red for the climate coming from the United Nations Secretary General, that's a near quote from him, and the media coverage about how this is portending the worst case scenario ever, but this is what they need to do to perpetuate their existence. But secondly, when you have time to go look through the report, now it's 4,000 pages. I haven't read all 4,000 pages. I have read through quickly the most important sections that would relate to whether or not we're facing a climate crisis, extreme weather events, things like that. Just like with the last assessment report, the actual science doesn't remotely support what you're seeing in the summary for policymakers and what the media are saying. I'm actually surprised that they haven't gamed their reporting of the science in the report itself to justify their existence. Because, for example, just this morning, as I was reading very closely the section on precipitation, droughts, etc., is that the science reported by IPCC itself says, well, we don't see global trends. We see intensification in some areas. We see less drought in other areas, which has always been the case. So the science itself that they are reporting does not remotely justify what we're seeing in the media. And that's a surprisingly positive development.
Yeah, well, what I found interesting is that I also looked at the report on precipitation because if you look at the summary for policymakers, they have these graphics which show different regions of the world, and they show ecological, they call it agricultural and ecological drought, as if drought was different for agriculture and the rest of nature. If it occurs, it occurs. There were only 2 regions of the world where they had medium confidence that agricultural and ecological drought might have increased. The rest of the regions of the world, they had little confidence. And yet there were all these little brown squares showing that drought, if you look at the pictures, it looks like drought's occurring everywhere or in a lot of places. But if you read the text of what those pictures actually say, they have 1 little dot, little confidence. 2 little dots, medium confidence. There were only 2 with medium confidence. It's funny. They misportray things in the photos. So one thing I find interesting in every IPCC report, but especially in this one, is what role they attribute to natural factors in climate change. Now, at least in the past reports, they at least genuflected to nature. They said, oh, well, nature does this. But we really don't understand it well. But what we really understand is really what drives things. This time, I don't see much of anything about natural factors which drive climate change. What happened to the sun, ocean currents, clouds? In fact, when they talk about clouds, it seems like there would be no clouds in existence unless humans were putting aerosols into the air. It's amazing.
It seems to me that they've basically kind of herded the science to where they wanted to say particular things and ignored it when they didn't want it to say particular things. So they've kind of got a mishmash of things that are unsupportable and confusing. One of my people that follows me on WhatsApp with that, Dr. Roger Pielke Jr., pointed out in a Twitter thread the other day, he talked about all the different confusions they have in it. And one of the most important things he said was, in general, no likelihood is, this is actually a quote from the report, in general, no likelihood is attached to the scenarios assessed in this report. And he says, so that means that users of the scenarios have to independently figure it out themselves, whether it's going to be good or bad or, catastrophic or whatever. And so they go through this report and they mention this RCP 8.5 model and the worst case scenarios, but then they also say, well, we don't really give any credence to it. So the whole thing is a mishmash. It's really it's a train wreck. I would say that's the best way to describe it because there is no consistency in the message. And I think it had to do with the fact that 2 weeks ago, it basically was said, hey, this model's not going to fly. It can't ever possibly happen. Climate science community agreed with that. And then they had to backtrack and throw this report, into shambles to try to make it out the door on time.
Sure. And when
but
those,
you know what?
if I can just weigh in a little bit here, when the scientists looked at the models, and of course we've known this in the climate realist community for quite some time that the models were running too hot, but just within the past few weeks, it's been acknowledged among the quote unquote mainstream climate publications and even the most alarmist scientists that their models were running too hot, and they acknowledged this publicly. So now you have IPCC that wants to have a message delivered that it's even worse than we thought. So what they do is they say, well, we're not going to put any weight on these models because they know they can't put weight on the hotter models. But now they present models that are even hotter than the ones that they've acknowledged ran too hot. And it's designed to provide cover for climate alarmists to cite the report, say things are worse than ever, perpetuate the crisis, perpetuate the bureaucracy. But again, the report itself, it does not give you any grounds to draw those conclusions.
Well, the sad thing is, I think we're being far too charitable to these guys. And the reason I say that is this. We pretend like they just found 2 weeks ago these climate models are running too hot. But in April of 2019, that's more than 2 full years ago, the journal Science said the models were running too hot and they were having trouble figuring out why. In July of 2020, another scientific journal pointed out the same thing. So they've known for 2 years the models were bad. They could have got it straight. They didn't want to get it straight. And when you read the document, when you read the IPCC report, they consistently say, despite what they admitted just last week, they consistently say these models are better than the previous generation of models. They produce better, more accurate results. It's like, hold it. You can't have it both ways. If you admit they produce worse results than past models, you can't then also say in the document they produce better results. It's sheer hypocrisy.
Yeah. And if you're a thinking person and you go through this and read these things for what they are, you realize their whole code red has become essentially a code beige. There's no other way to describe it, because the report itself is a complete mishmash. And even the top people that are involved in it are backtracking privately on some of their Twitter feeds, talking about some of these scenarios. And the bottom line is that we've been told this stuff for years, and none of it has come true. We've been told, I remember way back in 1989, a UN official announced that entire nations would be wiped off the face of the earth by sea level rise within 20 years. Well, they're still there. And a number of other scenarios that they've talked about related to model projections have not come true. And it's the same thing like what happened with the population bomb, that book by Ehrlich back in the 70s, saying, we're all going to be starving by 1990. It never happened. Models simply cannot predict the future accurately when it comes to complex systems like climate.
Well, and we'll get to it in a second, but let me see. I found several troubling aspects of the report. It's gross overstatement of expected warming based on the models that, once again, we've already discussed. For 2 years, they've known as flawed. It's misleading discussion of drought and agriculture, which James was talking about. But something that I wrote about yesterday in Climate Realism, the way it portrayed the threat to coasts from sea level rise and oceans, it literally lied at one point in the summary for policymakers, saying water was acidic at the pH range of 7.9, when in fact, science determined more than a century ago that any liquid is alkaline above 7. That misstatement was particularly egregious to me. I mean, they're just trying to rewrite literally basic science that spans not just climate science, but all science. James, what most stood out to you at AR6? Either something new that wasn't in past reports, or something particularly egregiously wrong or misinterpreted in this report or its summary for policymakers?
Well, similar to what you just said about, you mentioned a couple things in predictions. And what stands out to me is what stands out to me regarding the prior reports. And that is that the predictions are always dire. It's always, our new findings tell us that it's going to be worse than we thought. And that's what this most recent report does. But yet the evidence itself, what has happened in the real world, as you pointed out, regarding islands being overcome by sea level or whatever it may be, are exactly the opposite. And there are only so many times that you can say, we now know it's going to be worse. And then you put out a report that shows that things aren't worse before people stop believing you. And I think that as much as this report is in many ways outrageous in terms of the way that it's being presented, the way that they want people to react to the report, it's comforting to know that I think people are paying less and less attention to these reports, because people understand what it is, and that is simply a tool for alarmism. Nothing about the science. To the extent that it does address the science, it merely confirms what we've already known, and that is you cannot measure many, if any, negative impacts from global warming. They can't do it. They're looking for it. They can't do it.
Well, I did find one thing new in the report, and that is that they have changed their estimate for climate sensitivity. In AR5, they had a maximum climate sensitivity, meaning how much is it going to warm the Earth's atmosphere for a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere, was at 6 degrees centigrade at the top end in AR5. In AR6, they've now dropped that down a whole degree to 5 degrees. And the range of the likely scenarios and best estimates have also dropped down. So basically, they have said that the climate sensitivity is less, or the result of the climate sensitivity is less. But at the same time, they're pushing models that are showing a hellishly hot future. And so they've got a complete disconnect between how the atmosphere really works in response to carbon dioxide versus what the model predicts.
Right. Well, we've already discussed it a little over a week ago when IPCC, people writing the report, and the modelers whose models were used had to admit that their models were flawed. They were too hot, and they were driving scenarios that were too alarmist. Now, here's the problem as I see it. I think it's a basic problem. The fundamental projection that climate models are supposed to make is the temperature response to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, to increases or decreases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if the models can't project global temperatures right, if they demonstrate way too much warming, they don't match the satellites, they don't match the weather balloons, they really don't even match the land-based. They're too hot for the land-based measurements with all the urban heat island effect that's going on. Why should any of their other predictions they make be trusted? If they can't get the basic projection, which is supposed to drive everything else, why trust anything that's supposed to respond to radical temperature rise?
Yeah, and that's a great point. That's the key to everything that they claim we're going to face a crisis on. And yet, if the precondition for all these harms is not occurring, well, then you can't put any value in the harms themselves. One other point that comes to mind, kind of on a different topic than your point there, but nevertheless, I often hear when I'm debating or talking with people, and they have no response and no data to counter the data that I present, much of which has been presented by the IPCC in their past reports, but objective data from NASA, NOAA, et cetera. They say, well, you're cherry picking data. To the extent that this report attempts to paint an alarmist picture, and again, they have very little to present when you look at the report itself. But one of them that stood out to me was regarding hurricanes and tropical cyclones, and talk about cherry picking in order to support some type of media frenzy. There's a section that says that they have, I believe they said it's very likely that there has been an increase in tropical storm frequency in the North Atlantic. And yet when you look at the data for the globe as a whole, tropical storm frequency has declined. And I had somebody in a Newsweek interview just recently say, well, we don't live on a global average. So even if you say that these events are going down, it's where people live. Well, nobody lives in the North Atlantic. So whether you want to look at it globally or in specific regions, when you look at the report and more importantly, the data themselves, what you see is real world observations that completely contradict the alarmist narrative.
Yep. And they've also reduced their one good thing is they've reduced their talk about flooding. They have a statement in the summary for policymakers that says heavier rainfall does not always lead to greater flooding. Well, gosh, what a statement. Any meteorologist, anybody who can observe the sky can tell you that. But they basically have backed off on the amount of flooding. They've backed off on the frequency and intensity of heat waves a little bit. They backed off on a number of things. They say here, for example, the assessment of observed trends in the magnitude of runoff, stream flow, and flooding remains challenging due to the spatial heterogeneity of the signal and multiple drivers. Translation, we have no idea. We can't figure it out. So we'll make this big, funky looking statement to try to make us sound like we know what we're talking about.
Great point. And oftentimes when precipitation is brought up, people will say, oh, but the rain events themselves, we're having an increase in heavy rainfall events. Now, according to the IPCC's own report, they say there's been a decrease in tornado activity, a decrease in hailstorms. So what is so bad about having a good heavy rainfall, especially when rain is something that crops need, that replenish aquifers, replenish lakes, etc.? And only a negative consequence of that, or else it's a positive.
And when it's not accompanied by tornadoes, hail, or
right, exactly.
Yeah,
that's
we get more rain.
Love.
We get the good, but not the bad from the rainfall. It sounds like a winner to me. Anthony mentioned the heterogeneity of flooding. Well, it could be said the same thing, honestly, about sea level rise. The oceans don't rise on average anywhere. There is no ocean average sea level rise. They talk about the average produced by the models, but tide gauges show oceans rise faster in some places, slower than others, and they're not even rising at all in other locations. Some places the land is actually building and sea levels are falling. So they can't make an honest global statement about more sea level rise, because sea levels don't rise anywhere globally. They rise locally, and that's controlled by local development, wetlands development, all sorts of things, land subsidence.
Yeah. They got ahead of themselves back in 1989 when they made that statement about, sea level rise is going to inundate entire nation, wipe them off the face of the earth. Well, back then they didn't have a complete satellite program in place where they could actually measure sea level rise. And lo and behold, once they did get all that in place with the Topex Poseidon satellite system and started looking at the sea level all around the world, they discovered, hey, wait, it's lumpy. Some places it's got bumps and some places it's got valleys and other places aren't changing at all. So what do? You've already made statements saying sea level rise is going to be a big problem. And so now you've got this data that shows that it's, lumpy and disassociated. So they have to make these broad sweeping statements to try to fit this in, because they can't really come back from the kind of statements that they've made in the past. That's one of the big problems with climate change, global warming, and the whole climate science community in general. They got way ahead of themselves way back early on. They made profound statements, and these statements of gloom and doom, they kept perpetuating because they really believed it. They believed their models would actually work. They believed the future is going to be really dire, but it didn't happen. And so they're stuck with this messaging that they put out, and it will be a huge embarrassment for them to basically admit, well, that's really not a problem. So they have to kind of bring it back in little pieces. And so we've seen that in AR6. They've dropped some things down in little pieces, trying to backtrack just a little bit. But at the same time, the media is out there screaming code red when we've really got code beige going on.
Well, let me add something here, if I may. Anthony mentioned a couple minutes ago, he mentioned heat waves and how they were discussed and addressed in this report. And when you look at the actual report, it's really quite illuminating, because what the IPCC says is that globally there's been an increase in high temperature events, but also a decrease in extreme cold temperature events. Now, we know for a fact from mortality data and from peer-reviewed studies that cold kills far more people than heat. So if we have somewhat less extreme cold events and somewhat more heat events, the net is a benefit. But then also they go region by region. And what they say is that in North America and the United States in particular, where, by the way, we have the best equipment for measuring whether or not temperature extremes are increasing or decreasing, what IPCC reports is that, yes, there has been measurable decreases in extreme cold events. By the way, that invalidates the alarmist narrative that the Texas cold spell and an electricity blackout was caused by global warming. Global warming made it much less likely to happen, although it still can happen. But just as importantly, IPCC says that in North America, and America in particular, they cannot find a signal for increasing prevalence or severity of extreme heat events. So we're getting all the benefit they can measure, but they can't measure any harms. And what they're saying is that, well, maybe elsewhere in the world where they don't have quite as good detection equipment, that may be happening. But if you hear in the media anything about some heat wave in America or some extreme heat event, know that if they claim that global warming is the cause, the IPCC says, absolutely not. You better be reporting on something somewhere else in the world where we don't have as good information, because if you're claiming that for the United States, the IPCC itself says, no, that's not the case.
Well, I once again, I think Anthony was too kind to the IPCC.
I can't cuss on this podcast.
He's always trying to be kind to these guys. Look, he's right. They didn't have satellites when they put out their first report. You know what they had? Better than satellites? Tide gauge data from around the world that have been around for 100 years. And they could have checked that tide gauge data rather than relying on computer model simulations. They didn't. Had they done so, they would have found the world was lumpy way back 20 years ago and more. They didn't want a lumpy world, because a lumpy world isn't something you can charge big government with fixing. They wanted greenhouse gases causing dangerous things so governments can respond. And I want to get to that. Let me get to that.
Before you do it, we had a comment from a viewer I want to talk about. John made a comment about now every weather event is considered climate. And that's true in a lot of circles. They do talk about that in the media constantly. They'll take anything that's out of the ordinary from a weather event and try to turn that into a climate change thing. But here's the most important thing that anyone can remember about weather versus climate. Climate is an average of weather over a 30-year period. The World Meteorological Organization defines a 30-year period as a climate normals period. So weather drives climate, not the other way around. That's the most important takeaway you can think about here. If we can't trust climate model projections, what should people look towards to understand what is going on with the climate? And what, if anything, they, and this is important, their representative government should do in response?
Yeah, great question, Sterling. When you mentioned climate models, and you mentioned it again in your last question as well, people think, oh, well, computer models, it's driven by computer, it must be accurate. And you mentioned 1980s computer models. Well, in the 1980s, there was a computer model, not a climate model, but you programmed a game and called Space Invaders, where people come in, where Martians come in and destroy the Earth. You can create a computer model to say or do anything. And whether it's going to be the case is based upon what you were programming it with. So for Space Invaders, that didn't mean Martians were imminently going to invade the Earth. Similarly, when they produce these models that project all sorts of nefarious, horrible things that'll happen to the Earth's climate, those are only reliable as the underlying assumptions of the programmers and what they program into the models. And the people that are writing these models, again, these are bureaucrats who require the continuation of a climate crisis for their job to continue. So rather than look at these models, which have continuously failed for more than 30 years now on temperature predictions, on extreme weather events and other impacts, et cetera, what we look at is real world observations and actual data. And again, no matter what you look at, the actual data, whether it's hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, floods, wildfires, you name it, and as we document on climateataglance.com, we do not see a worsening of any of these events. How can you have a global warming crisis when temperatures are cooler than they've been over most of the last 6, 7, 8,000 years, and when we don't see many, if any, of the negative impacts that they project?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how. Politics, and that gets me to one of my final questions here. So several people in the comments section have brought in the political question. One of them, Marble Man 52, he says the ultimate agenda, destroy economies financially to make it easier for socialism to take over, which leads to my question. For the IPCC, the media, and alarmist environmentalists, the only solution to the so-called climate crisis is bigger government, ending the use of fossil fuels and giving international and national bureaucrats more control over the economy and the ability to dictate to individual people how they will live. Why is this the wrong solution, James? And why will it make the situation worse, not better, for all but sort of power-hungry politicians and business profiteers?
Yeah, the observation and the question, they're good ones. And many scientists genuinely believe that we're facing a climate crisis. I don't question that. But I also know it's undeniable that many organizations have a goal of replacing capitalism with socialism, have a goal of replacing individual national autonomy with the United Nations led government. And global warming is the mechanism that they see as most likely to accomplish that. That's the Trojan horse in which they put in their socialist agenda. And it's something that if you go to the World Economic Forum's page, their Great Reset of Capitalism, it's right there. They want to re-envision and redefine capitalism to not be capitalism, but socialism. When you look at the Green New Deal resolution that was put forward by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, only a small amount of that resolution had anything to do with energy, environment, and climate. Most of it was restructuring society along a socialist narrative. And there's the danger. If you say, well, we're not going to fight the science, we'll just look for maybe some market-friendly ways to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and we're going to let the climate left skate on their narrative that we're facing a climate crisis. Now we give them the imperative to and the excuse to restructure society in a socialist way. And we have to be very careful about that. That is real. That's something that they don't even hide.
Yeah. And, the thing about it is that it's been demonstrated again and again in the past that if you get people afraid of something, you can control them much easier. So if you make them afraid of the future, because climate change is going to decimate the earth, which, talking about code reds and all that kind of stuff, if you give them that and they believe it, then it's much easier to put in things that you tell them will actually solve this, like carbon taxes and reduction in personal liberty, like taxing you per mile of driving on your vehicle, or not putting in a new natural gas installation in a new home you've built somewhere in California, which is actually happening. So their whole thing is to scare you, to make it easier to control you.
Yeah. So James, Anthony, in closing, if there's one point either of you or both of you would like our audience to take away from our discussion of the IPCC's newest report and the mainstream media's coverage of it, what would it be?
For me, going back even to the first IPCC report, IPCC acknowledged and they documented that temperatures have been warmer than today, significantly warmer than today, for the vast majority of the time that human civilization has existed. So the takeaway is this, and it remains the same. There hasn't been any data to contradict what they reported going back to their first report. The takeaway is this: how can you have a global warming crisis when temperatures are unusually cool, not warm?
For me, it's looking at the way that this report has evolved and the problems that are in it. 4,000 pages. This report was done by a worldwide conglomerate of people that are scientists and educators and so forth. And every one of these folks, literally, is in the employ of the government for either the United States or their own respective governments where they live. This is it's essentially like a large corporate production. And a lot of people that distrust corporations, we have people that, rail against Monsanto, against tobacco, whatever it might be, are missing the fact that this is a huge money-driven operation. There's billions of dollars being put into global warming and climate science. And so what we've got here is a huge money thing that wants to perpetuate itself, needs to perpetuate itself. And so it's going to do whatever it takes to perpetuate itself by making statements that will ensure a continuance.
Yeah, I'll wager. I've not done the research, but I'd feel pretty confident wagering that more money has been spent on climate research and climate science in the last 15 years than was spent cumulatively up to that point in history. And it all goes away if climate change isn't a concern, unless we can bring back global cooling and the next ice age, in which case they'll say big government is the answer once again. It's been a great discussion. I hope it gives our listeners some hope that a climate catastrophe is not in the offing, despite the IPCC's claims. To learn more about the unalarming truth about climate, to learn climate facts, I encourage our audience to go to Heartland's various websites, which include climaterealism.com, climateatglance.com, Climate Change Weekly, and Environment and Climate News, which tracks the progress of energy and environmental laws that affect all of us every day. In addition, I encourage everyone to go to Heartland's website to find out how they can help support our mission of promoting sound science, limited government, free markets, and individual liberty. Thanks. Take care.